So we're going to look at insulation and air sealing and how those things get applied and installed. So in this session, we're going to look at the best practices for mitigating heat transfer, as well as managing infiltration and moisture. We're also going to talk about the installation of insulation, as well as the air barrier and the vapor barrier. Then we're going to look at a couple of examples of all three of those. But before we do that, let's look at a review of how air moves through a building and infiltration and exfiltration. If we look, because of stack effect, really most of our exfiltration is happening up at the ceiling line. So through vents, our bath vents, recessed can lights, plumbing stacks, so the holes at the top of interior walls where it allows air to get through and out into the attic. Attic access hatch, this is one of the really serious ones, as well as whenever we have a flue pipe or a chimney that goes through the ceiling line, we're going to find some exfiltration there. Then we have drop ceilings where the ceilings drop down. We have can lights in there. A lot of times we'll find some exfiltration happening in those spots. Then down below, we also see some infiltration through where we have like penetrations, electrical outlets. Sometimes we have some electrical outlets that get installed for Christmas lights or your electric lawnmower or something like that outside. So if those aren't well sealed, we get infiltration coming in through there. You look at doors and windows, infiltration coming through where we don't have good weather stripping, or just a window or a door that just straight up doesn't seal very well. And that can happen on the main level, but it's when you get down into the basement with basement windows, it gets really bad. If we look at dryer vents, if the dryer vents aren't sealed well, we have infiltration coming in there, as well as plumbing penetrations like hose bibs for outdoor water and that sort of thing. Those are all places where we can see infiltration coming in. And that, even though we want some air movement in a building, we don't want too much, because then we end up wasting money, because we have to condition more air than is necessary. If we take a look at air leakage, especially at the ceiling line, if we take a look at this picture, we've got our blower door running and we have our infrared camera fired up and looking at a bath vent. And we can see the streaking coming from the bath vent, and that shows us that we have air infiltration coming in because that bath isn't sealed really well at the ceiling line. Next to that, we have the access for the attic. We have an attic access hatch. And a lot of times, you'll find attic access hatches that do not have weather stripping seal on them. And as a result, you get a lot of infiltration or exfiltration in this particular case, which is exacerbated by running our blower door. Some of the things we need to do with an attic access hatch to fix that problem is weather stripping. We put weather stripping on that attic access hatch. We also put insulation on the back side of that attic access hatch, and that allows us to stop the heat loss moving through that attic access hatch. And also, we have to put what's called an insulation dam around that attic access hatch so that we can fill up the attic with the right amount of insulation, whether that be 14, 16 inches, whatever the right R value is. And then every time somebody goes into that attic access, we don't end up losing all of that insulation down to the floor. So you have that dam there, and that keeps that insulation in place. And then we put a piece of batt or foam insulation on the back side of the attic access hatch, and we attach it to the back side of the attic access hatch so that we can take it out, bring it back in, put it back in place, and we don't end up losing insulation in the process. A lot of moisture comes into the house through infiltration. We learned that in a different module. So in order to control that moisture, we need to make sure that we limit the amount of moisture or air that's moving in and out of the house around things like can lights, up into cathedral ceilings. Now, imagine if we had a can light in a bathroom, lots of moisture going on in a bathroom. That moisture goes out through that can light into the attic. Let's just say it's a cathedral ceiling. So it goes up into that cathedral ceiling, it hits that roof deck, and that moisture condenses on that cold surface. So we use, whenever possible, a top hat. We're going to see pictures of those in just a minute. But it's a seal that goes over the top of the can light and allows us to seal up that can light, but still dissipate the heat that comes from the light bulb. Now we can also mechanically vent the spaces where we have large amounts of moisture, like a kitchen or a bathroom, and we take that moist air and we pipe it up out of the house, and so that moisture goes outside and not into the attic area. So here we have a couple of examples of air leakage at the ceiling line and top plates, for example. Whenever you have a plumbing penetration that comes up through a top plate or electrical or anything like that, you have a place where air from the inside of the building can get into the interior wall, make its way up through the interior wall and out through that top plate. So making sure that top plates are well sealed using expanding foam is very important in controlling air leakage. This next picture we have is our recessed can light, and we can actually see, if you were to turn all your flashlights and everything off when you're in the attic doing an inspection, you can see glowing lights, and that glow is evidence that air can move through those can lights into the attic space itself. There's a debate that goes on with how to insulate and air seal attic space. One rule of thinking is found here in this slide, which is insulate at the roof line. So what do you think? Is it a good idea to insulate at the roof line? Well, the most important thing with attic insulation is to make sure that you have a nice tight air seal between conditioned space and unconditioned space, and you have a solid thermal barrier. So if you insulate at the roof line, as long as the roof line is well air sealed and there's a continuous thermal barrier, and that's aligned with the air barrier, theoretically it's fine. But here's the problem that I have with insulating and putting the air barrier at the roof line. So now you have an attic that's filled with conditioned space, but nobody lives up there. So now you heat the space below, and that heat moves its way up into the attic, and it gets stopped at the attic. But there's nobody living up there. You can't use that heat, even though you've kept that heat from going out of the space. So we might think that, in a situation like this, we're going to have soffit vents that allow the heat to escape out of our attic space. But if we're going to put the insulation, the thermal barrier, and the air barrier at the roof line, then there are no soffit vents in this particular case. We wouldn't vent this space so that that heat doesn't have a place to escape. So it would be sealed. Another problem with that is a lot of shingle manufacturers, if you opt to insulate at the roof line, will void the warranty. So you can imagine how upset a homeowner would be if you're the one who recommended that they do the insulation at the roof line, at the roof deck, and then they buy lifetime shingles, and then something happens to them, big rainstorm or hailstorm, and they get beat up, and they go to the insurance company, and the insurance company says, well, the warranty's void because of this insulation, the way this insulation is installed. So be really careful about this and what you do and how you do recommendations when it comes to attic insulation. Okay, so here we have a couple pictures of top hats. So the way a top hat works is there's a couple of different types. You can actually take metal, and you take the metal and you make a cylinder out of it, and then you take a piece of metal, cut a circle out, and then you tape it together so you quite literally have a top hat that you set over the top of a recessed can up in the attic. There's also a couple of new products out on the market, actually a cardboard product. It's a 5-sided cardboard box. You unfold it, put the top down, you tape it up, and inside it's got a fire-resistant material on it, and you just take that cardboard box and set it over the top. Very, very easy, very quick, makes top hats very, very easy. The nice thing about top hats is that even if you're burning a high-watt bulb, there's enough air around that can light to allow that heat to continue to dissipate without losing the air, so you don't end up burning up your can light or overheating your light bulb. One of the things that you can do, though, is recommend that your homeowners use CFLs instead of an incandescent light bulb, because CFLs generate less heat than the incandescent light bulb. Consequently, you can then cover up your top hat with insulation, and you don't really have to worry about heat dissipation from your can lights. Knee walls and hidden attics. Okay, these are two of the places we lose a lot of energy. And that's usually because they're just not insulated properly. Either the space going underneath the knee wall into the floor space isn't properly sealed, so it allows heat that heats up that space to escape out into the hidden attic area, or there's no insulation at all in the knee wall. That's also a problem. Or there's not a proper air barrier on the 6th side of insulation in the knee wall. Consequently, you end up with gaps with the insulation, between the insulation and the plaster, or the insulation and the drywall, allowing convective loops to happen in behind the insulation. You also end up with this cathedral ceiling that's at the top of the knee wall. And if the insulation in that cathedral ceiling isn't installed properly, you can also get air underneath that insulation, taking the heat from the back of the drywall or the back of the plaster on out through the vents that vent that space. You also have bath fans that can go into these hidden attic areas, and if those bath fans aren't completely vented to the outside, just like in a regular attic, they're now dumping moisture into that attic area, compromising the insulation. And you need to also make sure that in this hidden attic area, you have adequate insulation on the floor. So a lot of times you'll go into these hidden attic areas and you'll either not have any insulation on the knee wall, or you don't have any insulation on the attic floor, or both. And consequently allows heat to escape. Here's a good picture of what a gap in the insulation looks like using an infrared camera. Here, what you're looking at on this picture on the left is insulation that's been installed poorly in a knee wall. And so you can see some small cold spots where air has been allowed to get in behind the insulation and begin to absorb the heat from the house. On the right-hand side, we see a knee wall that doesn't have any air barrier at all, and it doesn't have any insulation in that spot, and consequently we can see where the air can easily get in next to the drywall and carry heat away. Another problem are chases. In this particular case, we see a chase that is open to the attic, and when we shoot it with our infrared camera, we can see where the cold air has been moving through this chase, taking the heat from the house through the drywall, through the plaster to the other side, and then taking that out into the world. Here we see a fireplace chase that's not properly sealed and insulated at the top, as well as on the right-hand side, we see the exhaust for a range hood. And we see, again, it's not well sealed. Consequently, conditioned air from inside the building can escape out through these holes. So the way we would fix this is come through and take a piece of tin or wood or drywall or something, a good air barrier, and seal that up. Use flame-resistant caulk, that red caulk, and then insulate over the top of it. We'd have to make sure for our fire paste chase that we have adequate distance between the insulation and any combustion source. But over here where we have a range vent hood, we can run that insulation up right up to that range vent hood because there's no heat being generated there. So we always want to air seal before we insulate. Here we have a wall that we would air seal first, as you see on the left picture, and then insulate as you see on the right. But it doesn't matter whether we're air sealing a wall, we're air sealing an attic. We always want to do the air sealing first, then doing the insulation, because when we insulate, the technician's going to do the best job they can, give you a nice, even, beautiful job, especially in an attic. And then if you have to air seal after that, you have to mess up their job. You got to go through, dig through insulation. If there was R11 there before and we put R38 now, you're going to have even more insulation to dig through in order to air seal. So we want to make sure that we emphasize to our homeowners that we want to air seal, then insulate. So if their job calls for insulation, make sure that air sealing gets done first. Permeance. Okay, permeance has to do with our air barrier. Permeance, or perms, is the amount of water vapor that can move through a material. So when we look at the permeance, for example, of cloth, permeance is going to have a lot, the permeance of cloth is going to be a lot higher than, say, the permeance of steel, for example, or a window. Okay, so when we go around and we're looking at different building materials, things like tile and plaster and brick are going to have a higher permeance or perms than, say, drywall or an actual vapor barrier like plastic or a poly or even paint. And this is important because permeance has to do with our vapor, controlling our vapor. Here's an example of a vapor barrier that's been installed on the inside of a house. Now, in a climate where the humidity outside is low, the humidity inside tends to be higher. Consequently, the vapor barrier will get installed on the inside, the interior part of the house, to keep that moisture from moving into the insulation. So we want to keep that moisture that permeates through the material inside the house and remove it using ventilation. Now, on the other hand, in a climate that has a high humidity outside, then our vapor barrier will go on the outside of our wall assembly to keep that moisture from permeating into the building. And then we have to get rid of it somehow through ventilation. So that brings us up to crawl spaces and basements. Building science's view of crawl spaces and basements has changed over the course of years as we begin to understand how we do things. So originally our thought was we put plenty of ventilation in our crawl spaces and basements to keep them dry. We need that air moving through to keep that area dry. That's changed. Now, we actually want to seal up our crawl spaces and make sure our basements are well sealed. And then we have a nice moisture barrier that keeps that moisture from moving into the building to begin with. For example, here we have a good vapor barrier that's been put down onto the floor. And you can tell that it's a rather lumpy floor. But nonetheless, that vapor barrier, that moisture barrier keeps groundwater from coming up and making that crawl space moist. So in approach number 1, this is where we're ventilating the crawl space. What we do is we take and insulate the floor above. And we insulate the floor above because if we're going to have air moving through our crawl space, then our crawl space is going to be cold during the winter, it's going to be hot during the summer. And so in that floor space, we have HVAC ductwork, we have plumbing, we have other things that we don't want frozen during the winter, and we don't want to lose, or we don't want them to gain heat during the summer. So consequently, we have to insulate that entire area. And sometimes we can do that with a net and blow. But a lot of times it's just not practical to insulate the entire floor above a crawl space. So that's why building science has moved to approach number 2, which is a very good moisture barrier on the dirt of the crawl space, and then insulate the foundation walls going all the way across, and then we seal up all of the rim joists. And if there were crawl space vents there before, we make sure that those get sealed up nice and tight. And we actually bring the crawl space or the basement inside the thermal envelope. And that way, we don't have to insulate all of our ductwork. So if you notice, this ductwork actually sits down below our floor. So we would have to, even if we did a net and blow, we'd have to insulate that ductwork. And that gets to be tedious and expensive, and it's really easy to miss spots. And this approach with the barrier on the floor and the insulation on the foundation walls and making sure that all our crawl space vents and our rim joists are sealed really well works good, and it's economical. Here's another look at a vapor barrier on a crawl space floor. And you'll notice that we already insulated up in the crawl space in the floor, up above. Likely this happened before we put our moisture barrier in there. Because even if and you'll notice, even with insulation up in the floor, if we still have moisture going on in our crawl space, that means our insulation can still get wet and our insulation can still degrade over time because of the moisture. Let's review. Through what mechanisms are heat transferred through a wall or a ceiling? 3 different methods. Actually, it's 4. We have conduction, convection, radiation, and air leakage. Air movement through the thermal envelope is called infiltration or exfiltration. Okay? Water vapor moves from high vapor pressure to low vapor pressure. So that's our overview of insulation and air sealing. Remember, we always want to do air sealing before we do insulation. And both air sealing and insulation are low-hanging fruit, good bang for the buck. They pay back fairly quickly. It's easy to do, relatively inexpensive. So they'll tend to be high on our list for our homeowners and when we're making our recommendations.